Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 15, Section 2, Roosevelt and Taft. So we're going to talk a little bit about kind of how these men were kind of the same and eventually how a wedge kind of drove these two men apart to become bitter enemies. But one thing I do want to mention is that both men kind of get the nickname of being a trust buster. And part of that was the fact that these men were certainly concerned about big business becoming glaringly too big and some unfair practices that were happening. And in a sense, one of their goals was to kind of even the playing field so that you could balance the interest of both business and competing groups in society. So we're going to start with talking about Theodore Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt, for the most part, considered himself a social Darwinist. He believed that the United States was in competition with other nations, and in a sense, only the strongest nations would survive. But at the same time, he had a heart. I mean, he was still concerned about the ordinary people, and at times when they're given kind of an unfair situation. And part of that came through some of the issues that were happening with business. I mentioned before, Roosevelt's going to be nicknamed the trust buster. And part of that comes from the fact that he didn't necessarily care for big businesses that were becoming very monopolistic at the expense of public interest, meaning that if the ordinary citizen was going to end up having to pay more or to suffer because of the interest of a monopoly, he wanted to even the playing field. And one of his targets actually became J.P. Morgan, who was at that time one of the richest men in the United States, if not the world. And he was going after a holding company that Morgan had acquired in about 1901. Because of the fact that it was in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. And for the most part, Roosevelt took this company, which was known as Northern Securities, and sued them. So it was Northern Securities versus the United States. And eventually, the United States is going to win. And this holding company of J.P. Morgan's is going to have to be kind of broken up as a result of that. And eventually, he gets that nickname as being a trust buster. So as a progressive, Roosevelt believed that government should adopt reforms to maintain an efficient society. Again, that fairness, that's making it fair for everyone. And to regulate big business without breaking up the trust, Roosevelt convinced Congress to pass something known as the Hepburn Act, which for the most part was supposed to strengthen the Interstate Commerce Commission, aka the ICC. And that ICC, and for the most part, went after primarily railroads because of the fact that they were charging higher rates for investors and people who were wanting to use the railroads. The unfortunate side about this Hepburn Act is within a period of about 15, maybe 20 years, the ICC and these railroad companies eventually kind of start working together. Initially, the rates and regulations were going to be set by the government for the railroads so that they wouldn't be overcharging, let's say, a Midwestern farmer to haul their goods to market. What's going to end up happening is the ICC and the railroads set these regulations where they end up limiting competition and preventing new competitors, new railroads from coming in and entering the market. And in the long run, it ends up hurting people, but that wouldn't be really felt until around 1920. Okay. Otherwise, Roosevelt was busy creating things like the Department of Commerce, the Department of Labor during his tenure. Part of that was to, keep an eye on big business, keep an eye on the workers. And in 1902, we had a major labor dispute in the United States in the coal strike of 1902. Roosevelt, for the most part, was concerned because our mine workers who launched the strike in the fall of 1902, right about the time when the seasons are changing and things are getting colder. And we had over 150,000 coal miners that walked off the job. And what ends up happening is they're demanding things like an increase in their pay, reduction of their hours. They wanted to make sure that the union would be able to recognize them. And as a result of walking off the job, coal prices basically skyrocketed. And it was a great concern for our nation because we had a lot of factories. If coal was too expensive, some of these factories might have to shut down, and you're going to have workers out of work as a result of that. Let alone the fact that we're moving into a colder time of the year. And without coal, we don't have fuel to heat homes. And so there could be a lot of people who would be left in homes unheated. Okay. Theodore Roosevelt was angry. He was angry kind of at both sides here. And so he called them to accept something called arbitration. Arbitration is when you bring an outsider who doesn't have anything to do with the dispute that's going on. So it's not a part of the strike. It's not part of the owners. What they do is they come in and they negotiate a deal between the two different parties. And whatever happens in that deal becomes binding, meaning that if one side doesn't follow up and do what they're kind of required to do by this agreement, that there could be a lawsuit. Okay. The owners of the mines agreed to the arbitration. The union and the workers that were on strike, they were a little slow. And what ends up happening is Roosevelt has to threaten the workers and the union with bringing out basically federal troops, bringing out the U.S. Army to get them to come to the table to negotiate. And what ends up happening is that our federal government actually becomes kind of like a broker in some of these deals between labor, the workers, and the owners for the most part. Consumer protection also becomes a big issue for Theodore Roosevelt. And in 1905, there was a guy named Samuel Hopkins Adams who was a journalist and who wrote a series of articles in magazines talking about patent medicine and kind of the big business that was surrounding it. Patent medicine is kind of like what the old timers would call the snake oil business. It's basically individuals who are selling so-called medicines, which are basically just alcohol and sugar and maybe some other additives that are kind of dangerous, like cocaine and opium, to consumers who, for the most part, probably didn't know what was in their products. Along with that, you had a guy like Upton Sinclair in 1906, who was also concerned about what was happening in the meatpacking industry. And he wrote a book called The Jungle, and this is number 5 here. And it resulted in the passage of what is known as the Pure Food and Drug Act to regulate the food industry. And not only that, but there was another part of this act that was known as the Meat Inspection Act. And I'm going to have you kind of find a little bit of paper here to write. But the Meat Inspection Act, as a result of some of the research by Upton Sinclair, basically would require the government to do a couple things. One, it would have to have federal inspectors look at the meat that is sold for interstate commerce. So if, let's say you have a beef producer here in Nebraska and they're shipping their cattle, back east for sale, someone's going to have to come in and inspect that. As a result, the Department of Agriculture would grade or rate the meat for sale. So it might be, choice cut, grade A, such. And then they would also set the standards for cleanliness of the meat packing plants. Part of this is to make sure that whatever is being packaged as, let's say, ground beef only is ground beef and it doesn't have any other impurities added to it. Okay, and if those impurities have been added, other ingredients, that they would be listed on the packaging. Okay, this is something that is important even in this day and age. Along with that, we had the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, and it basically said that the government would prohibit the manufacturing, sale, and shipment of impure or falsely labeled food and drugs. And so what's going to end up happening is that ingredients are going to have to be placed on different products. So if you buy a bottle of medicine, like a bottle of aspirin, it would say what goes into that. This is to make it safer for consumers, making it easier for them to make good choices when they went to buy something in the store. So, in number 6, realizing that the nation's bountiful resources were being used up at an alarming rate, Roosevelt urged Americans to conserve these resources. One of the things that he passed was in 1902, known as the Newlands Reclamation Act, and it authorized basically a law that authorized the use of federal funds from the sale of public lands to help pay for irrigation projects in the West. One of the big projects actually came from the Colorado River and how it was going to provide water for the city of Los Angeles. So all this is part of the big ideas that Roosevelt had. Roosevelt also backed efforts to save the nation's forests and establish new national parks and wildlife refuge. One of the things that he did within the whole idea of the forestry industry is he actually came up with this new department for the Department of Forestry. And what he basically did is he picked one of his best friends, a guy named Gifford Pinchot, to head up the U.S. Forest Service. And he picked this guy because of the fact that he was a conservative, or a conservationist, just like Roosevelt. And what this service was going to do is look at resource management. They would establish regulations to control lumbering on federal land. What's going to end up happening is this choice is going to come back to cause one of the greatest divisions in the Republican Party. So we'll talk about that here in a moment. But in 1908, Theodore Roosevelt opted not to run for re-election. He could have. There was no law that said he couldn't, but he kind of believed this idea that he had served pretty much the majority of McKinley's second term in office, and then he had ran on his own and won re-election. So he decided to step down. And in 1908, William Howard Taft becomes the Republican candidate. He's going to run against William Jennings Bryan, and I think you know what happens here. Bryan obviously loses, and Taft becomes your president. And Taft was a little different than Roosevelt. Taft believed that high tariffs limited competition, they hurt consumers, and they protected trust. And as a result of that, Taft is going to make this whole idea of reforming tariffs kind of a big issue. He had been warned by Roosevelt not to touch this issue because Roosevelt thought it might divide the political party. And in a way, maybe Roosevelt was right on this. Taft accepted what was known as the Payne-Aldrich tariff, which was really kind of a lousy compromise. For the most part, progressives like Roosevelt and Taft, what they initially wanted was a tariff reduction. They wanted to cut tariffs to kind of help the consumer, but also to help smaller businesses. And conservative Republicans wanted to maintain their high tariffs, and they were kind of using their power in Congress as well. And what ends up happening with this Payne-Aldrich tariff is that it really didn't cut tariffs all that much, and in some cases it raised them on certain products. And what ends up happening in the long run is it really kind of divides the Republican Party, and Republican progressivism kind of starts winding down. Along with that, that's going to lead to some other disputes that are going to occur. Suspicion of William Howard Taft's Secretary of the Interior, a man named Richard Ballinger, grew when he tried to make nearly 1 million acres of public lands, a lot of these lands located in what would have been Alaska at that period of time, available for private development, meaning that some of the minerals could be mined, or some of the timber could be obviously harvested. And certainly this made Gifford Pinchot, who was, the chief forester for the United States, really angry. And eventually Pinchot charged that Ballinger was going to turn over a whole bunch of this valuable land. There was a little investigation, and supposedly the investigation basically proved that that was inconclusive. But Pinchot was so angry that he leaked this information to at that time the media, to the newspapers, and eventually William Howard Taft is going to have to fire Pinchot. And as a result of that, you fire Pinchot, you're going to make Roosevelt unhappy. So we're going to have this great divide, and eventually Roosevelt's going to want revenge, and we'll talk about that in section 3. In number 12, Taft established the Children's Bureau. It was a federal agency that investigated and publicized child labor problems. And as a result of this, he's also kind of labeled as a trust buster. As a matter of fact, if you start looking at court cases and such, there are probably more trust busting lawsuits that are coming out of the Taft administration than there were out of the Roosevelt. So, certainly Taft might be the bigger of the trust busters. In number 13, Taft also set up the Bureau of Mines to monitor the mining companies, expanded the national forest, and also prevented the development of water power sites. So in a way, maybe Taft isn't such a bad guy, but the division between him and Roosevelt was really not going to be reconcilable. Thank you very much.